Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Newton. I'm the Director of Business Solutions here at Corporate Results Incorporated, and today we'll be going over the automation of Akron and WAWF submissions for Billings in the Costpoint 7 system. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Basic agenda for today is we are going to go over the basics of an ACRN setup. So we will be talking about enabling the billing features themselves, how we're going to manage those Akron bills. You see here we've got three different areas we'll cover: the billing requirements, the calculation methods, and the Akron details. We'll be also covering how to calculate standard bills, which needs to be done prior to calculating the Akron bills themselves, printing Akron billing edit report, and printing standard bills. Our agenda for the WAWF basics is the basic setup to configure the billing settings and the WAWF billing settings. We'll be going through some of the setup required. So we'll be talking about manage project WAWF info, manage project user flow, manage project billing info, and then we'll be talking about how we manage the standard bills, creating the actual WAWF files, exporting them, verifying that output, and then we'll be talking about a feature that's not required from Costpoint, but an option that you can do, which is upload the WAWF through a third-party software. And then we'll discuss some common errors that you might have as you go along that process. So we just wanted to hit on a couple Akron basics. What is an ACRN? So ACRN is short form for Accounting Classification Reference Number. It's used by several government agencies. It basically ends up being a two-digit alphanumeric character. The government uses it to match funding pools within a project to cost within each contract. So it's a way that the government is tracking their funding. It is also used for the submission of standard invoices and line item data through electronic submission using the WAWF functionality. So the first thing we need to do with Costpoint 7 is we must enable the Akron billing features. It's not something that happens by itself with Costpoint. You must tell it that you want to use it. So to do that, we would go into the projects domain, the billing module, use the billing control application group, and then find the application called configure billing settings. You'll see in the upper area, we have a picture of the screen here. You will see that we have highlighted the breadcrumbs for those of you familiar with the system. Mid of the options box, you'll see a highlighted box that says enable Akron billings. To use the features that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, you must check that box. I'm also going to point out that if you're also going to be doing WAWF submission, and we're going to use the project product bills to do that. So I think you heard me mention before that we would be talking about standard bills, which is the preferred, not the preferred way, but the usual way of doing Akron billing and WAWF submission. But you could also choose to use the project product bills to do that as well in WAWF. That would need to be initialized here as well. Okay, so next screen we're going to go to is we're going to go to the actual Manage Akron Bill screen. So once we've turned on the functionality, we now have the ability to actually utilize this particular screen, because beforehand we wouldn't have been able to access it. So if you don't go and check that box, it would basically say, you know, you have not set up your system to enable the Akron bills. Okay, so this is the screen where you're going to set up your Akron billing rules that are going to be used when calculating the Akron bills using the standard bill processing. That's what we're going to talk about today, the way we use Akron with standard bills. To get to this screen, we go to Projects, Billing, Billing Master, Manage Akron Bills. I want to make a note here that any bills that are manually entered in any fashion, as well as any progress payment invoices, are not eligible for ACRN calculations, Akron calculations. This particular screen we're sitting in here now, showing now, is used primarily for two purposes. One is to initialize the Akron data So in other words, we'd be setting up new Akron data, or if we were historically going back to set up a bill. So in other words, we might have done a bill offline because the functionality didn't work the way we needed to, or maybe it's just a bill we never initialized in our Costpoint system. We would use this screen to initialize the data, or the screen is also used for maintenance of the data. So in other words, if you actually got a modification in on a contract, this is the screen where we would do edits to that Akron data as necessary, okay? Pointing out each individual project, billing level of the project needs to be set up, and you see that highlighted in our box there. So you must set up each individual project at the appropriate billing level. I mean, that's a familiar topic for those of you who do billing in Costpoint, okay? It's important to note that if you're setting up a bill that was previously done offline, before this functionality was added, the history can be added here, as we talked about a little bit before. I will talk briefly about a note, note to those of you who are upgrading from Costpoint 6 to Costpoint 7.01 or even 7.1 if you happen to be on the limited release. You cannot modify the project level at and below field that's in the Akron detail table part of this screen. When the system was upgraded from 6 to 7, Deltek purposely did that to act as a data integrity piece during the upgrade. And so if you actually need to calculate amounts at a level below the billing project number and utilize that field in the data, you must basically put new lines in and delete old lines. So again, you won't be able to change and utilize that new project level at or below feature that was added in 7. You'll actually have to do some modifications to your old data. So as we previously mentioned, the data is entered into the managed Akron billing at the highest level, the billing of the level. In most cases, the active flag that you see on the screen, in the middle of the screen next to the project number, will be checked for projects that you're going to be computing the Akron bill against. But if you need to do input history for, like I said, on the older bills, then you might want to make it active long enough to enter the information and then turn the active flag off, okay? The next screen we're going to go to, or the next part of the screen, I should say, that we're going to talk about is the Akron calculations. Okay, so the billing requirement in the Akron calculations, we have 4 choices here. Okay, so we have 4 calculation rules. Only 2 of these rules allow for the use of WAWF transmission of those invoices. So we'll be reviewing that. I'll point those out when we get there. We're just going to start top to bottom. So the ACRN only, this is what we call the least restrictive option to set up ACRN billing. This option simply allocates cost across all active Akron lines, regardless of those costs. Okay, so for example, if you had a bill that had both labor and ODCs on the bill, it would allocate the cost to any of the Akron active lines that have funds, and it basically would fulfill the first Akron first and then go down the line. The next choice is Akron only with mapping. This has a little bit more restraint in terms of the rulings that you can do. You can use some other pieces of the functionality that we're going to talk about here. It incorporates the chart of accounts and project labor control, or project labor categories, I'm sorry. If the project has loaded labor rate billing information. So the point is that if you select this one, you automatically have the ability to use the account subtask screen that is at the lower right of this particular screenshot. It says accounts, little hyperlink. You can then tab into that as you put in your Akron detail lines, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, and you can actually specify specific general ledger accounts only that will feed into that Akron. So for example, if you had an ACRN line that only needed labor, you can actually go into that subtask and pick only the labor accounts, which then tie together that Akron with that account. Same kind of functionality on the PLC mapping. If you needed just a certain set of PLCs, maybe there was one Akron funding that was only for program management, you could then, if the billing formula was a loaded labor formula, you could go in and select the PM role with that particular line. So that's basically how those things work, okay? Your third choice here is Akron line item. this is one of the options to process bills through the WAWF. So basically, just like a lot of things in Costpoint, left to right, top to bottom, this particular is the first of the two that you can choose that work in conjunction with the WAWF functionality. This selection works in the same way that the Akron did, the Akron only one. So it works the same exact way in terms of how it allocates the costs. The addition of line item data allows the option to invoice by Akron, line item, and amount. So in other words, if you were to look at the Akron details table in the bottom of the screen there, you see there's a sequence number, and then there's an Akron number. So then that's the AA or whatever, AB, AC, whatever. And then there's, if you selected Akron line item, another column would be in that view, and you would add the line item, which is 6 characters in length. So a lot of you might be familiar with it being 0001 AA, 00001 AE, and so on, would be what you'd be looking for there. The final choice in the billing requirement is the Akron line item with account mapping. This is the other option to bill through the WAWF, and is the most restrictive option available in the billing requirements box. So the billing requirement allows you to enter the line item, but also requires you to enter either an account or a PLC, just as we discussed with the Akron only with mapping. You would do that. Note that it's very important to understand that this Akron looks at the history of the project and every account PLC the project has ever used, depending on if you're using account or PLC. So this formula, if selected, will actually go back and look historically. And so the caution point there is if you have not used or mapped all the accounts in the subtask for something that was in the PAG, you want to make sure you get that by using that. The other part of the screen I wanted to point out is right next to the active flag. At the top of the screen there, we have project and active flag. There is a box called Use Project Mapping. Okay, if you utilize that, that is where, if you look at the table, you have a column called Project Level at and below. So this is really where I can get complex rules around the ACRN. So not only can I say this particular line goes to this project level and below, I can also then tie it to accounts and to PLC codes. So I can get pretty complicated using 3 different areas to define my rules as to how the billing requirement looks at the calculation. The next part of this screen is the calculation method. There are 3 choices to choose from here. You've got FIFO, which is first in, first out. This calculation method uses the data entered into the Akron details table below, looks at the sequence number, which you'll see there on that table, the far left. It looks at the sequence number associated with each line in the table and removes funding. So in other words, it allocates billing costs to that Akron based on its starting sequence number, starting with 1. So in other words, as you enter more and more lines into the Akron details table, your sequence numbers are going to grow from 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. So first in, first out allocates all the cost of a bill to that Akron until it is depleted. So if you had $100, it's going to allocate $100, and then if your bill is for $110, it would move the 10 to the second line. So that's first in, first out. Last in, last out, last in, first out is the next choice. As you can imagine, this calculation uses the highest sequence number in the Akron details table. So in other words, if I had 5 Akrons, it would go to the 5th Akron because that's the highest sequence number and work its way basically backwards until that bill is exhausted, as I had mentioned with the first choice, first in, first out. And then proration is where this option is similar to the weighted average option for those of you who might understand the inventory features, where it applies a ratio of available funds for each Akron to the total remaining funds of all Akrons. So basically it's looking at cost, looking at all the different Akrons you have in that Akron detail table, figuring out how much is left. So it looks at each and every line and basically assigns a weight to each line. So if you had 5 lines and they each had 20% funding left on it, then it would allocate those costs back 20% to each line. Okay, so it's a fairly simple proration formula. The invoice amount and invoice or allocation amount fields that you see on the screen will only display after a particular Akron bill has been calculated. So you won't see anything in those fields until after you actually calculate the Akron bill. So again, these screens are just basically going back through what I had just talked about. And you can see here the various parts and pieces of doing a particular screen, okay? Once we've filled out our billing rules for the Akron in the manage thing, then we have to go ahead and put the Akron details in. And excuse me for a second, I'm gonna go back. I went one line too far. Okay, so this is an example of doing the Akron details table that is located at the bottom of the page as we've been talking about. So depending on your billing requirement, your options here will vary in terms of filling out the Akron's detail table. Okay, so we'll walk you through one kind of here, and that's what those slides were, but this is the last one we'll cover, which is the Akron line item with mapping. I want to go ahead and walk you guys through that. So basically what you do is you populate your lines based on sequence number. You'll see there we've got one, your Akron, which is AB, and then you'll see our line item, which is 4,000. And then we've put in that this particular Akron is active. You'll see that we have mapped it to a particular project, and then we put the Akron value in. So we will hit the account at the bottom in order to input the accounts that this project is charged. So that is depicted by the account subtask on the right-hand side of my screen right now. And you'll see the example here is that it is direct labor project. And so we are direct, starting with the account of 50-10-0000, which is a labor account. So I'd mentioned before how I can do it by account. And in this case, I'm actually showing the screen at the bottom of the right for the PLC mapping. The example we talked about was PM. In this screenshot, it's for an analyst. Okay. So once we filled out all of the different screens, you know, depending on for our bills and depending on the rules that we had put in, the one thing we need to do is we need to calculate the standard bill. So depending on your individual business process, the next step would be to calculate the standard bill. And so you would get there by going to projects, billing, standard bills processing, calculate standard bills. And so that's the screen we're looking at here now. So once you calculate a bill, and by this screen you're seeing how we're doing it by the accounting period in the particular project that we've shown in our example screens, CRI recommends that the best practice of comparing the PSR to the standard bill is something that we would recommend before you calculate the Akron billing, because we want to make sure the bill is right first. That way, if something doesn't quite come out right or something you didn't expect in the Akron allocations, at least you knew the bill was correct. So after we calculate the standard bill, we recommend that you compare the PSR to the standard bill in that screen. Only after the bill has been selected, then you can then calculate the Akron bill. So once you're satisfied with what was calculated with the standard bill, you would go into the Manage Standard Bill screen and actually select that bill. There's a little tab there that you would select. And so in order to calculate them, you would have to make sure it's selected. I would recommend selecting individual projects at first if you're just setting this up from scratch so that you're not doing them all at once. I know it seems a little bit more labor intensive to do one at a time, but when you're first doing this for the first time, it's a little easier to work through them one at a time. So we would recommend that you might do them one at a time as depicted here in this particular screen. To calculate them, of course, you hit the Action Gears button to calculate a bill in the standard bill screen. We had talked about once you're happy with everything, then we're going to calculate the standard bill. Again, this is the calculate Akron bill screen. So once we're done there, we switch over to this. That's projects, billing, standard bill processing, calculate the Akron bill. So we would recommend, again, you look at them separately. So once you calculate here, you go to the edit report. So this was just a depiction of where the screen is at. And again, the gears are there. You would select it to calculate the ACRNs. And then from there, you can go to, and we're going to show on this next screen, the ACRN billing edit report. Okay, so to get there, we go to projects, billing, standard bill processing, print ACRN billing edit report. And from there, we're going to enter all of the different parameters that we need. Again, we're suggesting one project as we work through this example. The report comes directly off the Manage ACRN Bill screen. So the stuff that's already sitting there in terms of how it allocated against your ACRN is where this is drawing from, and will show you the amounts based on your current bill. If you need to make adjustments then for the ACRN, you would then go back to the Manage ACRN Bill screen after it was calculated. So if you see something in this report that isn't right and you may need to make an edit, you can do so. You can manually edit. But if everything is good to go, then you will just continue to do the other steps. So the next screen we're going to show here is the actual edit report that you would get out of it. And as you can see here, it tells you the project name, whether it was active or not, and then it goes basically and shows you that ACRN table that we had set up, how it's actually allocating the bill cost from standard bills against those particular ACRNs, okay? Next, we're gonna go to print standard bills, and you do so by going to projects, billing, standard billing processing, print standard bills. So after we verified that the ACRN calculations were done correctly, we want to come in here and print the bills. So we want to make sure that when we're printing the bill, however, unlike a standard bill that's just, without ACRN, we need to go ahead and check the boxes that tell us to print the ACRN detail there. So that's what's highlighted in the bottom right. You'll see it says include, and then the checkbox for print ACRN data is also checked. Okay, so you have to make sure you do that. So the next screen is basically going to show you an example of the standard bill. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And then the next slide is the example of what you're getting with the ACRN worksheet. So this is how Costpoint 7 displays that. So basically you would get 2 pages for each bill or more, depending on the number of ACRNs that you have. Okay, so that is ACRN billing. We're now going to move forward with our WAWF, and as we talked about earlier on, this is our agenda. So we're going to talk about some basic setup and some screens that we need to manage to make sure that the data is contained in the file that we're going to create. And we're going to talk about creating the file and a couple other things about common errors to look out for and things of that nature. So next screen we have, the first step is to make sure that we have the configure billing setting screens. We talked about this earlier, that if you were going to use project product bills for your WAWF submission, that we need to enable that through the checkbox. Also, I'll point out that default output location is listed there. That is the file management system. So if you wanted to say, hey, all my WAWF files need to go to this one default location, you could set one up from a system-wide standpoint here, and that's part of the system administration file management features in Costpoint 7. You do not need to, it's not required to set up a default location, okay? The second step that we want to go ahead and look at is the configure WAWF billing settings screen. So this is where we're going to set up our various cage codes and our DODAX. Okay, and I know that's a little bit of a mouthful, but basically what we're going to need to do is set up this screen. We're going to go to projects, billing controls, configure WAWF billing settings. And a cage code, for those of you who are not familiar with the ACRN, is the commercial and government entity code. And then the DODAX are the Department of Defense activity address codes. Okay, so when we set them up in this screen, when we're actually managing our WAWF information, these codes are then defaulted. So in other words, like a lot of things in Costpoint, I'm setting up something to default into another area. Okay, so we're going to set up a cage code, and whatever we know about that cage code, we're going to set up the other various fields based on the information we have on any particular contract. Okay. The third step then is manage the project, the WAWF information. So to get there, we need to go to billing master, manage project WAWF information. So we'll need to fill this out based upon the appropriate billing level of the project. Again, just like our Akron, it has to be at the correct level. So contractually, we would know that, okay? From the above, the cage code will then populate the appropriate DODAC code. So in other words, that screen we were just at, if you look there in that sender information that's been highlighted on your screen, I have my project, but then in that cage code sender information field, once I type in that, the additional information about the DODACs that you see in the middle of the screen, where those things are, they come defaulting in. So again, like I mentioned before, trying to save time and get things done. The MOCAS pay system needs to be checked if you're using Mechanization of Contract Administration Services. That's a mouthful, I know. That's why I choked on it. We also want to make sure that we are looking at the file source and invoice types. So in the middle of the screen there, you'll notice that we have standard bills selected, which is what we're talking about today. So, but you also have choices for progress payment bills, which we had mentioned, and project product bills. We also want to make sure that the appropriate invoice type for our WAWF submission is checked. So in this case, we have a simple cost voucher, but as you see there, there are some other invoice types that are accepted by the government. CLINs, in the middle of the screen, you'll see our highlight there on the CLIN mapping method. We select the use Akron mapping, which is for the most accurate part of the transmission. And then down at the bottom, attachment file, this will be the attachments associated with the bill. So if you had anything you need to send in addition to the actual bill itself, you would go ahead and be able to select that file for attachment here. So certain bills have other attachments that are needed for submission, and that's how you would accomplish that. Okay. Moving to some things that you need to check to make sure that are included in your project setup, to make sure that when you create the WAWF file, that it has everything it needs. Manage project user flow. So if we go to projects, project setup, project master, manage project user flow, we want to make sure that the contract detail fields all have information in them. So that is one area that you want to make sure you have filled out. So again, the prime contract number, subcontract number, purchase order number are all highlighted here. The next screen we want to do some checking on is the project billing information screen. So we want to go ahead and go to projects, billing, billing master, manage project billing information, and we want to make sure that that highlighted last bill number is the correct one, because obviously as we create the file we're going to transmit, we want to make sure that the government gets the correct last bill number. So we just want to verify that the one we would believe to be accurate is what's listed in this table here. The system usually will up it from starting at 1 and continue to manage. Last, just wanted to point out that, again, just like in our Akron, we can't create the WAWF file unless the status of the particular standard bill is selected. So this is a screenshot that shows the drop-down menu used in the Manage Standard Bill screen to select that particular bill. Okay, so same as with the Akron. Probably already have it set to selected if you've calculated the Akron. Not the last step, but the next step, step 6, is to actually create the billing file. So to do that, we go to projects, billing, standard bills processing, create WAWF billing files. Okay. And so then we would input the appropriate data. So we would input a project, we can do it for all or one, whatever it is we're doing it for. The file name that is in the middle bottom where options are. So if you go to the options area of the screen and to the middle, you'll see where it says file name. The file name needs to be a .ftp. Okay. So that is the FTP transmission the government needs. The user ID that is sitting there at two areas below the file name, it's called user ID. That is the user ID registered with the government. That is not necessarily your user ID for Costpoint. I mean, I guess they can be the same, but there is a user ID that the government will give you to submit WAWF files, and that must be that ID. Okay, so that is a required field. If you don't fill that in, you're probably going to get rejection, or you will get a rejection from the WAWF program. Okay. Once you have filled all that out, you would use the Gears action button to create the file. You can then use the process menu and select file download from this screen to actually download the file. So once you hit the gears and the little thing came up and went from 0 to 100 and said complete, if you went to the menu of Costpoint 7 and select the file download, it's going to take you into the screen. I'm going to show you a little different area, but it's going to take you basically right to the screen instead of having to go out into the menu area and then go to it. But in this next screenshot here, you can get to it through the administration module. So you've got two choices to get to basically this area. One, by using the file download that I just talked about within the Create WAWF screen itself, or you can come through by going Administration, System Administration, File Management, Export Files. Based on the file name you put in that creation screen, you would go here and then you could export it directly by using the Export File button that you see on the screen in the bottom right. Okay, so once you then export that file, then you would log into the WAWF application from the government and you can pick that file right up there, and that's how you would load it. We are going to talk about a slightly different approach, although the next slide here, we would recommend that we verify the output file. So after you export it, we would suggest that you look at it in Notepad like we are here in this screenshot and just take a good glance at it and make sure that it looks right. I mean, if you're familiar with processing these, you understand that, that very first one is, you see Dave Newton there. That's the user ID that we talked about. You would see the last bill numbers, the period of performance. So you would see these different things in those various fields. And for those of you who are familiar with the WAWF program, these fields and field names are familiar to you. Okay, so we would recommend that you verify this output. And then one of the things we wanted to share with was one of our customers wanted to make sure that the transmission of the file to the government was secured. So basically, if you did what I said before, which was to just export the file into that text file and then go to the government and pick it up, you're really not in a secured environment. So we had actually set up a little secured solution for a customer of ours. And so the system being portrayed in the picture here is called FileZilla. And this is a third-party software which directly connects you from your server to the WAWF server. So there's no in-between by going to the web. This is a direct connection server to server, so this is not over the web. You'll be given a username and password and a host ID to connect properly. And then after the file has been generated, the Notepad file and the corresponding backup documentation with the same name get placed in the WAWF folder for review. And then you will get a message at the top of the software verifying the connection and a successful transmission. So basically, this allows you, again, to connect server to server. On the left-hand side, as you see here on the screen, on the left-hand side middle, you'll see that is your local network drive. And on the right is the actual, the box called remote site is the WAWF. So what you're not seeing is that in this case, we've not transmitted the file. But basically, if you needed a secure server-to-server solution, FileZilla is something you can use. There are a couple other products out there that do similar functionality, connecting directly server-to-server. So, I mean, this is basically file transfer protocol software. Some common errors that occur. With attachments, line number 26 needs to match the file name. You heard me just say that previously when we were talking about the FTP product. So the file name of the WAWF bill and the file name of the attachment need to match, okay? You cannot use I's or O's in the file name. Government doesn't like that. The BVN and invoice number cannot be used prior. So in other words, no duplicates. The period of performance needs to be valid. The attachment needs to include all backup in one PDF. So you can't bifurcate the number of files. They all need to be one big file, if you can appreciate that. CLINs and SLINs need to have funding remaining. So you can't send information for a CLIN or a SLIN that has no funding remaining. It'll error out. And the funded value needs to match. So the funded value that you have in your Costpoint system is going to have to match what the government has in their system. And if not, that's a pretty common error depending on the relationship. If you had any questions about what we went over today, please don't hesitate to contact us. I've provided my contact information here. Dave Newton again at CRIresults.com. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something today about the Costpoint 7 Akron and WAWF billing functions, and have a great afternoon.